3 weeks ago, Keir Starmer said it plainly. The United States would not be allowed to use British military bases to strike Iran. He said it publicly, on record. Then, almost overnight, that position vanished. No press conference, no statement to Parliament, no address to the country. And while the British public was distracted by everything else, something extraordinary happened. Iranian missiles hit a UK military base. British fighter jets scored their first combat kills in years. A Royal Navy warship is now sailing toward Cyprus. And Iran's foreign minister has personally warned Britain that it is now a participant in this war. So what actually changed? And why is nobody asking that question? Let's start with what we actually know. Iran launched a coordinated drone and missile strike targeting RAF Akrotiri, a British military base on the island of Cyprus. It has been British sovereign territory since 1960. It houses both UK and US forces, and it was just attacked. The strike was intercepted, partially. British and US air defense systems destroyed most of the incoming drones. But make no mistake, Iran targeted sovereign British territory. Under international law, that is not a provocation. That is an act of war. At the same time, RAF 35 fighter jets, British jets, conducted strikes over Jordan and Iraq, the first confirmed British combat kills in years. And now, HMS Dragon, a Royal Navy warship, is reported to be heading towards Cyprus, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a deployment. So let's be very clear about what this timeline looks like. Iranian drones hit a British base. British jets engage targets in the region. A British warship moves into position. That is not observation. That is not diplomacy. That is involvement. But here is what makes this story strange. Just weeks ago, not months, weeks, Keir Starmer was asked a direct question. Will the UK allow the United States to use British military bases to strike Iran? His answer was no. Explicitly, publicly no. That was the position, on the record. Then something changed. We do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly why. There was no press conference reversing that position, no emergency statement to Parliament. The British public did not vote on it. They were not consulted. But what we know is this: UK bases are now being used. British forces are now intercepting Iranian drones, which is, legally speaking, active military engagement. And sources inside the British government have told the Times that a warship is already en route. This is a pattern we have seen before, because the last time Britain quietly edged into a Middle East conflict without a full public debate, it was Iraq in 2003, and that decision is still defining British politics more than 20 years later. So the question is not just what is happening. The question is, why was the public position reversed with no announcement? Who decided that, and when? To understand where this is going, we need to understand where it started. Britain and Iran have one of the most complicated relationships in modern history. In 1953, British and American intelligence services orchestrated the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime was attempting to nationalize Iranian oil that British companies had been extracting for decades. The British-backed coup installed the Shah. He ruled for 26 years. His regime was brutal and deeply resented. And in 1979, it collapsed. The Islamic Revolution that replaced him was, in significant part, a direct reaction to decades of British and American interference. That resentment never fully disappeared. It runs through every negotiation, every sanction, every military confrontation since. When Iran looks at a British military base in Cyprus, it is not just seeing a NATO installation. It is seeing a symbol of what it considers decades of Western interference. That context matters, because it tells us that for Iran, this is not purely strategic. It is personal, and that makes the escalation risk significantly higher. We are halfway through this investigation. If this is giving you context you are not getting anywhere else, subscribe and hit the bell. This channel exists to dig into the stories that get buried. More is coming. Let's talk about what Britain actually has at risk, because the numbers are significant. 300,000 British nationals currently live and work across the Middle East. These are not tourists. These are people with jobs, families, and lives who woke up this week in a region where the UK is now a declared military participant. Then there is the economic dimension. Britain depends on oil and gas passing through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel between Iran and Oman that handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. If Iran closes it, or even credibly threatens to close it, UK energy prices do not just rise. They spike. Fuel shortages, heating costs, transport disruptions, the kind of economic shock that reshapes governments overnight. And here is what Iran understands that Western media often misses. Iran does not need to defeat Britain militarily to win this confrontation. It just needs to make British involvement expensive enough, politically, economically, publicly, that the pressure to pull back becomes impossible to resist. That is the strategy, and history suggests it works. So, where does this go? There are 3 realistic scenarios on the table right now. The first is controlled engagement. The UK continues its current role, intercepting drones, allowing base access, sharing intelligence, but stops short of direct strikes on Iranian soil. Tight, careful, deniable. The second is escalation by accident. This is the one military analysts fear most. A British jet shoots down an Iranian aircraft. A missile kills British servicemen. A warship is targeted in open water. In any of these cases, Britain does not choose escalation. Escalation chooses Britain. And at that point, the political calculation changes overnight. There is no quiet path back from British casualties. The third is full coalition entry. Nobody in Westminster will say this out loud. But if the United States decides it needs allied ground support, if pressure from Washington becomes impossible to resist for a government that has already reversed its own policy quietly, Britain becomes the logical next step. That is not conspiracy. That is how alliances work. Former RAF Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell has described the current UK approach as trying to keep well clear of the conflict. His assessment of the broader war is that America may achieve a military victory, but a strategic failure. He believes this is an unwinnable war, and that Britain should not be drawn in further. But here is the uncomfortable reality that nobody in Westminster is saying out loud. Britain is already in it, not by declaration, not by vote, by a series of quiet decisions that have placed British servicemen in the line of fire, British bases on the target list, and a British warship in the Mediterranean. That is not a policy position. That is a fact on the ground. And facts on the ground have a way of making policy irrelevant. Here is what we know. Britain entered this conflict quietly, without a parliamentary vote, without a public announcement, without the transparency a democracy is supposed to demand when it puts its people in danger. The pattern is familiar. The justifications are familiar. And if history is any guide, the moment to ask hard questions is before the next escalation makes them impossible to ask. 300,000 British citizens are in the region tonight. Oil markets are watching the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran has already told Britain, clearly and publicly, that it is now a participant in this war. Whether the British government acknowledges that to the public, or whether the British people ever get a real say in it, that is the story nobody is telling. Until now. If this investigation gave you something most channels will not, subscribe. Share this with someone who will not hear this anywhere else.